Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at European defence on Bastille Day and after a Brexit. We're doing so in the company of former French UN General Dominique Trinquant. Welcome back to Professor Frédéric Charillon, the former head of the French Defence Ministry's Strategic Research Institute, IRSEM. From London, Nick Whitney, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And from Toulouse in France, Thomas Withington, the editor of the Armada Defence Review. Back in 2010, it was France and the UK signing what we've been talking about here, the Lancaster House Treaty, which means we've seen joint patrols, we've seen the development of a Franco-British military drone, the use of air bases, and much more. All that, though, sounds like it's up in the air now that Britain is leaving. Listen to the French president, François Hollande, in his big Bastille Day interview. He sounded like a man ready for a pivot.
What I plan to ask our partners is to set up a European budget or additional European spending specifically aimed at protection. France will not be the one to bear most of the burden. We already do more than our share in terms of protection. But Germany just announced that they will increase their commitment to defense.
General Trinquant, does that Germany pivot sound like the beginning of the end of the entente cordiale between France and Britain?
Not at all. I think that you clearly quote the Lancaster House, which is very important. It's a bilateral agreement. There was a big exercise a few weeks ago between the British and the French, and we are building an expeditionary force like we did in before. And probably the French and the British army are in Europe, the two armies who are able to work the more together. I was in operation in '95 in Bosnia. We had no agreement at that time with the British. In 2 weeks' time, we were able to go into action, when at the same time the German-French brigade was established for 10 years and never was in operation. So what I'm saying is that because the French army and the British army are based on an army able to go in operation abroad, they are more able to work together, and the Lancaster House is very important for that. Where there is a change is that it's in the EU agreement, and clearly there will be a change because the British were for years forbidding to have a command structure and to have a firm EU base for command and operation. And then when they will be out, it will be easier to establish that with the help of the German. But as far as a force going out and in operation, I think the French and the British are more able to do that than the rest, with the rest of the European armies.
Well, Thomas Withington, you agree? Don't hold your breath on any Germany pivot?
I think it's an interesting point that the President brought up, and also some very interesting points the General raised just now. One thing I would throw into the discussion is we need to be realistic that in 10 years' time there might not be a Britain. Clearly, there's going to be a renewed vigour in Scotland for independence and a renewed fight for independence. If that then happens, the size of the British Armed Forces will almost certainly be diminished. And that will have ramifications for the extent of the cooperation that is possible, not just between France, but between possibly the English armed forces, Scottish armed forces, however that works out, and the rest of Europe. And it will be interesting to see, for instance, what could happen to the Anglo-French military relationship if one of those partners, i.e. the UK, suddenly becomes a lot smaller in terms of its military capacity. I think there's another couple of points also which are important. Britain also has to get over the squeamishness that Iraq and Chilcot have brought in, which manifested themselves in the vote on the decision to support the French, support air operations over Syria in the wake of the French attacks last year. And I don't see that mentality really changing in Britain anytime soon. And on the other hand, the diminishing size of British military power, if this does happen, could actually be a good thing for EU defence policy. It could help foster that command structure that the General was discussing just now, and might be the jolt that Europe needs to actually get a kind of European army or some kind of European armed force to become a reality.
Of course, there is one conflict of late. David Cameron, let's not forget, had his own war, and that was Libya, along with France's Nicolas Sarkozy. The two of them went in there. Nick Whitney, those kinds of interventions, again, are they something that we won't see in the future and that we will see this pivot by France away from Britain?
Well, I hope that we do learn a little from the failed interventions of the last 10, 15 years. I mean, the Chilcot report is very sobering about all the mistakes that were made in Iraq. Afghanistan has been another fairly disastrous involvement for the British Army, demonstrating that blind adherence to US policy is not a smart move. And Libya was a mixed success. I mean, my own view on Libya was that it was entirely right to save Benghazi, which is what the operation was initially about, but arguably we went too far having done that in effectively going on to do regime change there when we had no means to restabilize the country. But certainly I do see scope for a strengthened Franco-German defence relationship emerging in the wake of Brexit. There was a very interesting joint statement by the two foreign ministers, France and Germany, the day after Brexit, calling for closer cooperation, including in the security and the defence domain. And in a strange sort of way, I think that there's nothing that would encourage the British to come back a little towards Europe in these matters than to see that France, Germany and others were capable of managing without them. The great risk from the British point of view, I think, is that we simply say, well, nothing has changed, we are a great power, we are a great force in NATO, we have bilateral relations with France through the Lancaster House agreements, and we can carry on as we are. Whereas, as my colleague Thomas has pointed out, we really do need to get a lot more realistic about our weight in the world and what we can realistically aspire to as a strategic power. And what that means, in my view, is a lot more cooperation with European partners if we are to continue to count in the world.
All right, Frédéric Charion, we've heard two perceptions of Britain in this discussion. We heard Nick Whitney in part one of our discussion talk about how Britain can be seen as a force for obstruction when it comes to building a European defence. But we also heard General Trinquant mention how, give his example about in Bosnia, where the British and the French have a similar mentality, work well together when it comes to intervention. Tell it to us straight. What's the water cooler chatter when you're at the French Defence Ministry? What do they think of the British?
Oh, it's an everyday partner.
Really, it isn't. They don't talk about.
No, of course, it's a difficult partner,
stuff like that.
But it's a difficult partner, but a very strong one. That's always been the paradox between France and Britain. We know that they are a pretty hard partner in the EU, but in other frameworks like NATO, because we haven't talked a lot about NATO, but NATO is a key framework for us all in those operations. And France has made many steps towards NATO in the last years, as we know. So Britain represents exactly this ambiguity. We know that in the EU, within the EU, the least we can say is that the UK was not very eager to promote a Europe as a key strategic and political actor in the world. On the other hand, they are, with France, one of the two big armies in the EU with a strategic culture that allows the country to carry on in initiatives and military operations abroad. That's why.
And that's going to continue?
Probably yes. Maybe not in the EU framework anymore, but it was not really the case. But on a bilateral basis and within NATO, it will be the case, of course, because there is no one else. And trying to replace simply Britain by Germany will probably meet many obstacles beyond the political will of Germany and Angela Merkel. The public opinion in Germany doesn't have this culture to support.
Doesn't have the culture, however. Times have changed since what you were describing in the 1990s. This very week, the German defense minister submitting what they call a white paper, a policy program, much more ambitious than in the past. And when she delivered that white paper, Ursula von der Leyen pulling no punches when it came to Britain.
In my experience, I can tell you that Great Britain has consistently blocked everything that Europe has written on greater EU military cooperation. And that has, as I said before, paralysed Europe regarding common security and foreign policy.
Is it the same Germany as when you were in the field?
Yeah, I mean, the German minister is right, but we are talking about concepts. Soldiers are not talking about
You think
concepts.
the German soldiers haven't changed?
No, they haven't changed. I mean, we in operation. Look, the Germans were in operation in Afghanistan, in the far northeast of Afghanistan. Everybody knows that they were not moving, they were not going outside, they were not solving the problem. We have changed the German army in 1945. We know why. We've got the result now. And the German army currently is not a fighting power like the British army is. So it can change. They can put more money in the budget, which could be interesting, because we need, for example, in support, in many things, we need more money in the European army generally. But to change, the last time the Germans were with the French were in Congo, in Kinshasa, where we really pushed the Germans to come with us, because we found that the French alone is not good for Africa. We need to have partners, and it was terrible. I mean, they were in their base, and they were never going outside. When they had to go 20 kilometers from Kinshasa, it was the French special forces who had to do it, not the German. So I think we are a long way to have a German army able to go in operation like the French are doing, and like the British can do it very quickly.
But again, we're having a new political will, it seems like, in Berlin. Thomas Withington, is it changing?
I would echo really again what the general just mentioned now. I think, you know, my sort of limited experience of seeing German troops in action and spending time with them is that they're an incredibly professional and highly proficient armed force. But I think the problem Germany has is Germany is still largely configured to deal with the prospect of the Cold War and of Russian aggression across the inner-German border, as it was during the years of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. Those armed forces have not really changed beyond that posture. Yes, they have deployed to Afghanistan, for example, but the Germans, I think the Germans have problems and do not have the wherewithal to strategically project power rapidly in a way that the British and the French do. The Germans, they don't have aircraft carriers. They've got, okay, an airlift fleet. That's a good start. But they're not really configured in that way. And partly because historically they've never needed to be. Germany is primarily a land power. It's a European land power. So there needs to be a change of doctrine as well as a sort of change of strategic culture. And there's one thing, the politicians having aspirations for it, but there's quite a different issue then getting the money and then getting that will down to the armed forces and configuring them to do that. It's a very long, difficult, and most of all, expensive job.
All right, you talk about expenses. Both Britain and France have seen those defense budgets shrink since the end of the Cold War. And now, as Frédéric Charion was saying earlier, with the prospect of Brexit triggering a new recession, there's the wonder of whether those budgets will shrink even more. France slipping to seventh there if we look at this chart. And there you see the percentage of GDP that is spent on defense. Now look who's number one on the list by a long shot, and that is the United States of America. Nick Whitney, I'm speaking to you from a country where we have one aircraft carrier. Does Brexit and the prospect of recession mean that, well, the U.S. will have to pick up more of the slack when it comes to defending this old continent?
I think the interesting question is whether America would be willing to. I mean, if the world suffered the misfortune of a President Trump, we have a guy there who's explicitly said that he's not interested in spending American money or American lives in protecting Europeans who are too lazy to protect themselves. Hillary Clinton would be obviously not as brutal as that, but there is a mood in the States that there's long been, many decades, a mood in the States that Europeans free ride on the Americans for their security. But I think we'll hear that more prominently in the years ahead, whoever is the next US president. On the other hand, we seem to have bottomed out on our defence spending cuts in Europe. The trend is now modestly upwards again. Germany, for example, has very substantially increased its defence spending in the course of the last year. And given the situation on the eastern border, although there are many threats that we have to contend with from Mr. Putin, the threat of hard military capability is, in my view, well contained now by the very recent forward deployments that have been agreed by NATO at Warsaw. So I'm not too worried that we're going to be a continent that is naked in front of Putin. I'm much more concerned about whether we're going to be a continent which is capable of in any way managing the chaos to its south.
Managing the chaos to its south, meaning across the Mediterranean.
Across the Mediterranean into North Africa and further down into the Sahara, which of course is going to be the source of unending immigration problems for us and refugee crises, unless and until we can help those countries to achieve greater prosperity and stability and security for themselves.
Frédéric Charion, is the trend going to be towards a real European defense like it's been talked about, since the 1980s? What, do you remember? I remember Bastille Day parade where there's this, what was it? There was, help me out here, General. There was this Europe Corps that marched on the Champs-Élysées. Or is, again, is this just a pipe dream?
Well, in the concept, General made the difference between concepts and facts, and I think that's the point concerning Europe and defense, because it depends on what kind of defense we're talking about. If it's a concept, if it's a try of conflict prevention and trying to work together to give more means to something more institutionalized, probably the departure of the UK will help a little bit, in the sense that indeed France and Germany, for instance, will multiply statements of intentions towards more European defense in terms of projection of forces, in terms of concrete and real operations that we have to decide very quickly. I'm afraid that the EU won't be much more efficient without the UK. We could see in the last years when an operation was decided, be it Libya or anything else, France and Britain remain one of the only actors able to do it. So European defense as a concept or a dream will be probably strengthened by the departure of the UK. But the concrete operations and projections of forces would be probably harder.
So right now, there are all these Franco-British projects taking place. For the soldiers that are actually on the ground, is it just business as usual and they don't pay attention to what the politicians are saying?
I think we're talking about the threat in the south, and clearly when we're talking about the threat in the south, the French are a bit alone. When you're in Sahel fighting, you've got the French forces with the African forces, and training, you've got the EU. Training in Bamako, in the capital, at the back.
But there's other things. There's the patrolling of the Mediterranean. This
in naval operation, you're right. It's a bit different.
Italy has talked as well about helping out when it comes to.
No, you're right. I mean, this is really defending the border, because the border is the Mediterranean, and then you've got the people in the Mediterranean. In Somalia, it's the same on the Djibouti and Somalia. Interesting enough, the EU headquarters is currently in UK. So what will happen in the future, because there will be no headquarters EU in UK. But on the ground, fighting on the ground, where you need the will to send your soldier and perhaps, sadly, to bring back body bags, then you've got to have a will. And you've got the French who are able to have the will. We know that the British were able to do that. For the other European country, it's another matter. It's very difficult. I'm not saying that this will not happen, because Mali was an important operation where suddenly the French deployed, were helped in logistic terms by the British, by the way, and by other European countries, and then to do the training on the Malian forces, all Europeans came, and inside the the UN operation MINUSMA in Mali, now you've got Netherlands, for example, which are present, and you've got the German who decided to bring a battalion there. So you've got to move because the threat is there, and now I think the European country realize that after the 90s and the peace forever is finished. And there is a threat. We've got to fight this threat. But this will be progressively, I think the budget, increasing the budget is interesting, but the effect will be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, not tomorrow. So we've got, the French forces will still have to fight in Africa, even if they are alone. But the Europeans will join in the near future in 5 or 6 years.
When you say the Europeans, what do you mean? Do you mean a supranational army?
No. I don't think about that.
Right.
I don't think about that. A soldier is going to fight to give death and to receive death, and you can't do that under the umbrella of an organization like the EU, an administration. You see, a soldier have very strong links with the tradition and with the country. That was what I'm saying about the 14th of July, the communion between the citizen and the army. So I don't see in the near future a European army, and that will be something dangerous to make people think about that, because then we go back to concept and not to reality. The reality of the soldier is very different.
All right. I want to thank you, General Trinquant. I want to thank Nick Whitney for being with us from London, as well as Thomas Withington in Toulouse, Frédéric Charillon. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So a certain amount of coverage of the announcements in Paris and Berlin today about European defence. First of all, looking at this article in the Finnish press, France and Finland push for common EU defence policy expansion. The Finnish Premier was in Paris today, and both issued a statement of calling for a stronger security and defence policy across Europe. We're also seeing similar announcements coming from Germany. The defence minister saying that in the past, in fact, Britain had really stood in the way of foreign and defence policy. She actually was quite vocal about that. She said, "I can tell you from experience in the past that they refused any such movements in this direction. It paralysed the European Union on questions of foreign policy and security." So even a certain note of, I suppose, happiness really about this obstacle from perhaps not being as present anymore, and speaking also about more bang for the buck. That's at least the headline in this German.
Frédéric Charillon, we've seen in the comments just generally about Brexit, you know, we heard the French foreign minister call Boris Johnson out for telling lies, but the Germans have seen even blunter when it comes to, be it the defense minister or the foreign minister. They've been really straightforward.
Yeah, probably the appointment of Boris Johnson is another shock after Brexit. Brexit is already something we have to deal with, we have to handle, we have to cope with that today. Doing it with Boris Johnson is probably another blow to the Europeans. Probably that explains the very harsh reaction of the Germans. And it's very strange, I agree with you, to have such a level of
no sugarcoating.
It's totally, totally.
Well, the word monstrous was used by the German foreign minister in reference to his appointment. Just a quick look at this article in SputnikNews.com, the Russian news website. New German military policy reveals splits in European defence doctrine. I'll just list out the points they're making in this article. First of all, NATO is attempting to have to put in place more clear control of its member states. We've seen a lot of divisions within NATO countries. For example, example, Turkey in recent times, even if that's not within the EU. Secondly, the US is conflicted about an EU army because it's overstretched with its troops in Europe, but a lesser presence means lesser political influence. Thirdly, the UK will continue its centuries-old opposition to the idea of an EU army, whether Britain be within the EU or outside. What they're basically saying here is for centuries, a sort of a German-French alliance or army, if you like, or EU army has not been something that Britain wants.
Do those points stand? Because I've seen Barack Obama give many speeches on defence, and he's always telling the Europeans, hey, how come you don't do more? How come you don't have more soldiers?
Yeah.
But leave us in charge.
More spending, mainly.
Meanwhile, there's also the point being made in this article and also being made in certain tweets that it's all very well for Germany to be talking about an increased military spending, increased military role in Europe, but there will actually be quite a degree of opposition within Germany to this idea as well. A lot of Germans have been brought up with a very strong anti-militaristic sort of culture, if you like, from an early age. And indeed, there's a question of what other European countries would think about a stronger German military. It's not necessarily something that everyone would be in favour of.
All right, James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 debate, and happy Bastille Day.